I've known George for about 4 years. We went on the board of the Montana Human Rights Network at the same time. I think it was 1994. And we've been together ever since. George has served in a variety of capacities, and I've gotten to know him well. And he's just one of my favorite people. He's been at Montana Tech since 1967. He's a professor of history there. He's very active in the community. He's on the board of the Citizens Technical Environmental Committee. He said, be sure and mention something environmental in Missoula. But that'll always play well here.
It doesn't play well with me.
He's also an aspiring politician. He ran against Joe Quillisi for House District seat 36 and ran a good race. Unfortunately, he lost, but he's still with us. He's speaking tonight about a subject that is very important. And I was looking at the last Human Rights Network newsletter where George did a review on a book dealing with fascism. It was on George's recommendation 6 months or a year ago that I read the book, and I was just flabbergasted at the extent of Nazi penetration in the United States after World War II, as well as in Latin America and throughout much of Europe. It boggles the mind to learn that our government, in the form of the CIA and the Pentagon and State Department, were assisting these ex-Nazis. But it's also interesting to learn that the recent militia movement has ties, both ideological and in some cases personal, to these people. And I think there's a real story here, and George is in a great position to tell it to us. So let's bring him up.
I'll just begin by picking up where Ralph mentioned this book by Martin A. Lee, The Beast Reawakens. And what Ralph and I have found so valuable about this book is that it begins in 1945 and does trace the personal history of a number of individuals who were active in the SS and as Hitler's bodyguards, who then remained active in West German politics for the next 40 years. And there's one scene wonderfully captured by this journalistic author. It is in no way a difficult book. It's a reporter's take on what's been going on for the last 40 years. There's a wonderful scene where this former colonel of the SS, who was Hitler's bodyguard, is given a standing ovation in Orange County, California, by a group of very right-wing youth and millionaires for his work in keeping white supremacy alive for those years. One of the chapters toward the end has a very good little description about the importance of the Aryan Nation in Idaho and also John Trockman's militia of Montana. And the journalist attempts to really make a connection between the Oklahoma City bombing and individuals who are coming in and out of these different Christian identity compounds in the United States, and also a transatlantic connection as well with the descendants of the Nazis, the real Nazis themselves. What I'd like to do tonight is simply give you a little bit of overview of how I got involved in this subject, because I have to admit it, I've been a very retiring academic almost all my career. But one of my former students came to me in the beginning of 1993 and told me, George, you really should listen to a radio program that's on the Butte radio station now. And it turned out this radio station was had given 50 minutes of prime drive time, airtime, to a radio talk show host named Bob Fletcher. And as we listened to this program together, we decided we better start taping these programs. And so altogether, Bob Fletcher was on the radio on one of two of Butte's major AM stations for 3 months between January and April of 1993. And the statements that he made on that program were statements that I could easily imagine being made in Germany in the late 1920s by members of a whole variety of ultra-right-wing groups, not just the Nazis, but a whole variety of right-wing groups. And I then began trying to kind of cross-reference these ideas with the ideas that I was familiar with from studying, from teaching modern European history for over 20 years. A good friend of mine, Barbara Archer, who is a Congregationalist minister in Butte, gave me the name of my talk, and she asked me to give it first at her church in Butte. Chilling Echoes, because that's what I was hearing. I was hearing chilling echoes of that long forgotten time of the late 1920s and early 1930s in Europe. And what Mike Kavanaugh and I finally did was we ended up having this big collection of tapes, and we turned it over to Ken Toole and Chris Kaufman of the Montana Human Rights Network, and that's when we organized our little Butte Human Rights Coalition, basically to take on Bob Fletcher. But he lost his sponsorship in Butte, and I don't think it was because of the letter that we wrote, complaining about the kinds of things he was saying on his show. For example, 1993 was just when Bill Clinton had come to the White House, and if you remember, he had sponsored a national immunization program for low-income children. And Bob Fletcher was telling people not to take their children down to the Civic Center because this was a government plot, that this was a way of spreading the AIDS disease by government officials. It comes right out of the X-Files. You listen to Bob Fletcher. I once heard John Trockman on television say that Bob Fletcher then went on the next year, and he became the public relations officer for the militia of Montana. And John Trockman said, we just leave you alone with Bob Fletcher for an hour or two and you'll be Fletcherized, which was a nice joke on that movie with Anthony Hopkins as well. But indeed, this is the kind of stuff that was being put forward on radio, that no matter what institution you belong to, it was a tentacle of some shadowy international group that was had these plans, of course, to create the New World Order that George Bush so unfortunately had made so much of, which played right into the hands of the ultra-right at that time. Whether it was a kindergarten or a daycare center or a bank or a university, it was all tentacles of this New World Order. One of the things that Mike and I picked up on was that in many of the shows, Bob Fletcher would say, all of this is public record. Everything that he was saying was public record. And so we followed up on the 1-800 number that he gave. He began to give it, I think, most times at the end of the show. At first, he didn't reveal where his information was coming from, and then he began to tell us where we could get the information. So in the course of time, we phoned the 1-800 number, and we got some books, and we got the major book. Let me turn now to a few transparencies just to put you in sync with what was going on in Butte in early 1993. You see here Bob Fletcher's name is the fourth name on this little leaflet that was left at the post office in Butte. It was their first seminar on preparing for the coming catastrophe for Butte citizens. It was attended by about 65 people in a motel in Butte, and most of the people came from Bozeman and Missoula and Deer Lodge. There weren't too many people from Butte at the seminar. The name that we recognized, of course, was Red Beckman. Anyone who's paid attention to the political scene in Montana for any length of time recognized Red Beckman as a great tax protester. Every time you would read an article about Red Beckman in the late 1980s or 1990s, the press would depict him as a tax protester. Well, Red Beckman was much more than a tax protester, and he made that quite evident at this seminar. The individual at the top in the yellow, George Green, was the publisher, was the source for Bob Fletcher's facts that he was giving over the air. And he's, I think, a rather important individual in terms of helping to finance as well as provide the literature for the spread of these ideas in the Northwest. This is a little catalog we received in the mail from George Green. I think Mother Jones magazine a year ago was advertising this catalog in it. You'll notice that the address became Bozeman, Montana within a year. George Green, I guess, was convinced by Red Beckman and John Trockman and Bo Greitz at that time that he should stop publishing his items in Nevada and move into Montana. I just received his latest catalog beginning of this month, and he's now back in Nevada, so maybe that says something optimistic for us all. This is the book. This is the book to read if you really want to find out what's going on in the United States, and this is where Bob Fletcher was getting his information. By the way, now, Bob Fletcher has made 2 videotapes, and they're for sale now in George Green's latest catalog. But this is the book that opened my eyes, that finally made that little connection in your mind where you say, I think I'm confident enough now to go public with this, to talk about the militia of Montana, and Bob Fletcher and George Green as being involved in spreading these fascist ideas. I could finally put the name fascism on them. And for any of you who have tried to read anything about the history of fascism, it's very convoluted, it's very complex. And why it is that is because fascism takes on a different identity from nation to nation. Its fundamental idea is a very aggressive nationalism and a very restrictive idea of who is a citizen. But it will take different forms in different times in different countries. And so this is one of the things I basically had to convince myself of. You could have a fascist United States without having, brown shirts in the streets or people yelling Il Duce on the balcony. You can have it because it can make use of homegrown American values to clothe itself in. Well, I just want to call your attention to a few highlighted items on this sheet. The powerful group that knows no national boundaries. It's the Committee of 300. I suppose I would have said, why don't these people, change some of their terms? It makes it too easy. I'll get back to that Committee of 300 in just a minute. Notice the date here on this. This book tells precisely who they are and what they have planned for our future, how they have been at war with the American nation for 46 years. Well, I got out my calculator and I figured out if you subtracted, if you added 46 to 1945, that would give you the publication date of this. This has been a plot going on against the United States since 1945. And 1945 is the key date. I teach history, and students are always asking me, do we need to know any dates? Actually, 1945 is a date that people should remember. Besides that publication of Dr. John Coleman that I'll return to in a moment, George Green also publishes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is considered to be the most famous anti-Semitic libel. It was published first, I think, in the 1890s. It has a strange history itself. It was first appeared in a novel by a German, and then it was taken over by a Frenchman, and then finally an officer in the Tsar's secret police decided this would be a good way to scapegoat the Jews when Tsar Nicholas was having a hard time at the end of the 19th century keeping his empire together. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion gives this scene, of a Jewish graveyard in Prague, in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, where once every year the representatives of the leading Jewish financial groups in every major country in the world gather to basically report their progress on how successful they've been that year in taking over the world. Well, this was translated into English then in the 1920s, I think, or during World War I. And George Green still publishes that translation of this horrible anti-Semitic tract, which all scholars who have studied 20th century anti-Semitism say is at the basis of this racial anti-Semitism that finally leads up to the Holocaust. George Green is also a major publisher of this new literary form called Holocaust Denial. Back in 1993, I think, an Eastern scholar named Deborah Lipstadt published a very important book called Denying the Holocaust. And like Martin Lee in The Beast Reawakens, she traces the individuals involved in creating this story that the Holocaust had never occurred back to a group of the supporters of Hitler after World War II who recognized that the Holocaust was something that was so horrible that if Nazism was ever going to be reawakened again, if Nazism was ever going to get good press, that Holocaust had to be buried. And so in Deborah Lipstadt's view, denying the Holocaust is very important to the ultra-right movement today because it turns Nazism then into just another political party or just another political movement. It's different from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's just a bit more open in terms of its love of nation. So that becomes very important. Well, these are the kind of very cheap books that you can buy from George Green on the trillion-dollar lie, the Holocaust. And he gets this term from the fact that he maintains the nation of Israel as being able to get $1 trillion from Germany and the United States and the West in payment for something that never occurred. If you turn to chapter 11, you find him reprinting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in here for free. This was my epiphany, as Flannery O'Connor would say. I was hit with a big book
when I used this in my class in European history. A few years back, I had the opportunity to go to a very large library in the Midwest and make a whole bunch of Xeroxes and charge it to the American taxpayer. And luckily for me, one of the Xeroxes that I made was of a leaflet that was produced by the Nazi Party in 1920. And it was in the back of my mind that I had used this leaflet. I passed it out to my class in 20th century history back in the late 1970s when I came back from that library, and then I stuck it away in the files. And so I found it. And this was the 300 number that jumped out at me. Remember, the audience for this leaflet in 1920 would have been people who were suffering from very high inflation in Germany, a middle class that was really destroyed, but also blue-collar workers who were good German nationalists, men who had just returned from being defeated in war. And so there's a middle-class appeal to it, but there's also a basic blue-collar working-class nationalist appeal. And in the leaflet, of course, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a foundation document for the Nazis' campaign against the Jews. From what I read, one of the key theorists in the Nazi Party between 1919 and his execution later on after the war had been a Russian emigre, or at least had to flee the Baltic region just after World War I when the communists came to power. And he brought a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to Munich and translated it for Adolf Hitler when he joined the Nazi Party. So this is the source. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the source for the beginning of this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic rhetoric that we find running throughout Adolf Hitler's speeches and pamphlets from that time onward. 300 big bankers, financiers, and press barons who are interconnected across the world are the real dictators. They belong almost exclusively to the chosen people. They're all members of the same secret conspiracy which organized world politics, namely the International Freemasons Lodge. The Freemasons Lodge turns up time and time again. There's nothing that I could have done, I think, in my preparation that would give me the insight into the Freemasons Lodge that I needed to understand how they're connected. Again, just by happenstance, in a catalog produced by, well, it's the publication arm of the Liberty Lobby, Wells Fargo's Liberty Lobby in California. The Liberty Lobby publishes The Spotlight, which is a major ultra-right, anti-Semitic weekly publication. That same publication firm also publishes historical books, and two of the books that they publish and are bestsellers were written by an English woman named Nesta K. Webster, and they were written just about the time of World War I. I think one was written while the war was going on, and the other was written in 1922. And Nesta Webster rang a bell with me for a strange reason. 30 years ago, when I was studying for my master's in history at the University of Washington, Scott Lytle, God rest his soul, had given us a wonderful bibliography in his course in the French Revolution. And he had starred Nesta K. Webster's French Revolution for us. And then he spoke to us, I think for just 4 minutes, on, you should become familiar with this, but don't pay any attention to it because it's a crackpot book. And he said, you should pay attention to it because of what's going on in the United States today. That you will run into if you go out and teach in high schools in the state of Washington, you will run into people who will give you this view of the French Revolution. And the view is, the French Revolution was basically financed by Jewish bankers who were attempting to attack the Roman Catholic Church and family values and great monarchies of Europe. and that the Freemasons was organized by a Jew in Germany, in Bavaria. And so this is the connection I made then. Through Nellie Rivon, I got hold of Nesta K. Webster's books, and indeed, I found out through that little bit of research that she was a crackpot of a particular kind. She'd be out there in the Aryan Nation right now if she was here. She is one of the key figures in the Christian identity movement. Comes from a very, very wealthy English family, but bought into this idea that the English people were, one of the lost tribes of Israel, and that they are the chosen people. And so when you read her, you read a woman who is into British imperialism and believing this is God's plan for the world, that the chosen people are indeed these Nordic, blue-eyed, blonde people who live in the British Isles and in Northern Europe. And Jesus Christ was indeed one of them. So I don't think she is that explicit in her books on the French Revolution. It's a book that she writes about the Russian Revolution of 1917, where she tells this. Well, here are guys, in Montana in 1998, and in Idaho in 1998, who haven't advanced one whit beyond Nesta K. Webster. This is still the same line they're giving. Well, here's where you get into the strange turns fascism takes. That element of American fascism could be a religious element rather than the secular element in Germany, where Hitler wasn't about atheist. That you could have a religious twist given to your American fascism because of this strange thing called Christian identity that was invented by an Englishman in the middle of the 19th century. Are there any members of this church in the audience? I'll pay for any damages that Okay, bringing it all home. Marlene Hines sent me this flyer in 1993. Dr. John Coleman, right in Montana. The fellow who wrote The Conspirator's Hierarchy, the little Bible that lays it out, just who are these shadowy people who are going to destroy your lives. Spoke, according to this flyer, in Bonner. Well, actually in Potomac, I guess, but this was in the Missoulian in July of 1993. So there are certain benefits of having people like Bob Fletcher live in Montana, of having George Green live in Montana, of having Bull Grights living in Idaho, that you get to see these world-renowned authors right out here in rural Montana. I did not get notice in time. And in 1993, I don't think I would have paid much attention to it. I can tell you that what I'm talking about tonight, it took me 5 years, really, at least 4 years to put this stuff together. Who is Dr. John Coleman? Well, he tells you in the introduction to his book that he had worked for the British intelligence for 20 years. And that it was only when he was in Nigeria in the 1960s that he was privy to some very high-level secret intelligence reports that convinced him that he really wasn't working for the British government, that he was working for the Committee of 300. As a matter of fact, all CIA agents, they worked for the Committee of 300. Intelligence officers in Soviet Russia were working for the Committee of 300. A big game was being played on the rest of us. Well, who is in this Committee of 300? Well, the usual, round up the usual suspects. You can probably name some of them tonight. There's a guy named Rockefeller in the Committee of 300, right? Henry Kissinger's in the Committee of 300. George Bush was in the Committee of 300 at that time. Now it's probably Bill Clinton that's in the Committee of 300. Who runs the Committee of 300? Well, Lyndon LaRouche. Here. You know who Lyndon LaRouche believes is behind everything bad in the world? Queen Elizabeth II runs, the mother goddess lives. She runs the Committee of 300, except it's not that easy. Because it turns out Queen Elizabeth II, though she's the titular head of the Committee of 300, is not the real power. So, then in a very strange couple of pages in his book, it tells you that back in the 16th century, the first Queen Elizabeth had chosen an aristocrat named Cecil to head her intelligence department. Well, it turned out Cecil had changed his name. That the Cecils are one of England's oldest Jewish families. And so that's how the British monarchy got to be the head of the Committee of 300, because they've been working for the Jews ever since the Protestant Reformation. They've been working for the Jews. Well, this is the horrible thing of this. The message is just so plain, but it becomes so convoluted. Let me just show you one more transparency. It's your tax dollars at work. Panel 1, how our government controls dissent. You shot the Black Panthers while they were sleeping? Even asleep, they were incredibly fierce. Imagine if we'd taken them while they were awake. The next one, how our government raises revenues. The Contras say, thanks. Now, I should say this cartoon was put together before the Gary Webb wrote his article about the interesting way the CIA had of raising funds in Los Angeles. And then Biotox Incorporated Special Projects Division, how our government provides security. Check this out, Senator. A 12-inch house flag, a bargain at $3 billion. And then lastly, how our government reassures us. Americans who fear government are paranoid. They should be locked up in secret jails, drugged, their assets frozen. Well, that's the message of Bob Fletcher. This particular cartoon appeared in Liberal Opinion. And this particular cartoon, by the way, very well provides my look at the government today. I very much follow Barbara Ehrenreich. You had Barbara here in Missoula, we had Barbara over in Butte. When she says that, she was changing her mind about the government. What is the government doing today? We're financing a giant buildup of prisons in the United States. We're getting rid of any welfare program for people. We're undercutting all social programs. We're hiring more police force. This is not the government that I remembered, John F. Kennedy and LBJ being in charge of when I was forming my ideas about politics. There really is a place where people like myself, who I consider myself to be on the left wing of the political spectrum, where we really do come together with people like Bob Fletcher and John Trotman. But we do not buy into this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. That to me is the monster in what I see as the ultra-right's rhetoric and the ultra-right's solutions to the problems we have in the United States. Because it's a myth. You can't have a solution that's founded on a myth. And it's so dangerous to our democracy to buy into this kind of scapegoating. Well, let me turn now just to make a few comments about fascism. I passed out a handout before I began speaking, just to raise questions among you in terms of what I see are the important elements in fascism and how they play out in terms of the United States of America. If I were going to envision a fascist government in the United States, or the dream of, what does John Trotman really dream about as his replacement government for the government that we have today? What would be the components of that? In Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, these were the things that fascists hated, that they opposed. And why they opposed democracy and egalitarianism was because fascists believe in elites. They believe in elite rule. They think that the average person can be duped too easily to be trusted with such a thing as running a nation. Important thing as a nation. They were against liberalism and individualism because liberalism puts emphasis on protecting individual civil liberties and puts the nation or the group second. It puts the individual first. And so that doesn't tie into fascism's emphasis on nationalism. They're against parliamentarism, or against the way we have representative government in the United States. They simply say, what goes on in Parliament or Congress is nothing but special interest groups cutting deals, and you can't run a nation that way. You have to have a firm, absolute value system where interest groups are basically not allowed into Parliament. It strikes me they picture Parliament very much the way I think we picture a Parliament, say, in Iran, where people have to be tested for their values first before they're allowed to make these kind of decisions. And of course, they're opposed to communism, Marxism, and socialism because, first of all, they're internationalist movements. They're not nationalist. And secondly, they would put their hopes in kind of proletarian rising, where fascists basically believe the lower classes should be looked after, but should play no role in doing anything themselves. And interesting enough, the fascists were opposed to materialism. They saw materialism coming out of the United States as a very corrupting influence on the values of the society. It reduces us all to simply mere consumers of material goods. What the fascists then supported, a socio-political revolution. Wherever fascism came to power, interestingly enough, in Italy and Germany and Romania, for example, there is a revolutionary aspect of their movement. But they really don't come to power because of revolution. They come to power because they're able to make a deal with some frightened group that is high in the power chain. But they talk about a socio-political revolution, which would get rid of democracy or get rid of parliamentary forms of government and create some kind of elite leadership system. Militarized politics. I mean, this is one of the most striking things about the militia of Montana. It seems to be, a revival of the brown shirts in Germany or Mussolini's black shirts. This idea that the best way we can have to destroy democracy is simply terrorize people, simply turn political gatherings into bloody fistfights. That is really what Hitler's brown shirts are all about, providing him the kind of terror tool that he needed to keep some people at home and bring out other people. Ultra-nationalism is a strange term. In the United States, we claim that we have a civic nationalism. That is, if you profess belief in certain basic principles, if you swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, you can become an American citizen. Ultranationalism says no. Ultranationalism says we demand more of you than that. And so ultra-nationalism could very well say, we demand that you all be of the same race, or you all be of the same religion, or you all have lived here for your families have lived here for several hundred years before you can be considered a citizen. And Red Beckman talks about that, so does John Trotman, in terms of what they call organic citizenship. They say that if you wouldn't have been a citizen when the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were ratified, you wouldn't be a citizen today. That's the way they come across the organic citizenship. That anyone who has gained citizenship after 1800 would not be part of their America. There's an English political scientist named Roger Griffin. Without him, I wouldn't be here tonight. I've stolen so much from that guy. He's published the one and only fascism reader I know of. It's a marvelous collection of source materials from fascists, from, well, Richard Wagner, for example, in the late 19th century would have qualified as a good fascist. From the late 19th century right up to the Turner Diaries, you'll find little examples. But he wrote a wonderful analysis of fascism called The Nature of Fascism in the early 1990s. And his thesis is basically this. When you strip away everything else and you come down to the kind of fascist minimum, what are we left with? What really defines whether some movement is fascist or not? And he says you have to have a dynamic socio-political movement. You have to have a movement of people who are really dissatisfied with the way things are going on in the country, mobilizing themselves and mobilizing in the streets. It has to be a mass movement. And they mobilize around grievances. Okay? They may not all agree on what they want, but they all know that they're living in a time of decadence. They all know they're living in a time of national sickness, of ill health for the nation. That somehow the good old days are gone, and the group in power right now means nothing other than decay and degeneration. And so they put themselves forward as avengers of a whole list of national grievances. If the nation has lost a war, this group will want to restart that war and win it. Or they'll want to find the traitors here at home who caused the nation to lose that war. Or they'll look at some political leaders who have been responsible for corruption in high places, who have demoralized the people or caused the moral values of the country to be undermined. And so there is a tie-in with people who will bomb abortion clinics, that they are basically, if they are nationalists, they can be seen as avenging what they consider to be a national disaster. They're all elite-led populist movements. That is, you have to have people like Dr. John Coleman or people like John Trotman or Bo Gritz or Bob Fletcher who really know what's going on in the world to lead these movements. So far, none of those guys are really charismatic. But if you can get someone charismatic, and it looked for a while in 1996 or 1992 as though there was a rising star who went so far and then I guess he got to the brink and pulled back. But if you get someone like that, the sky's the limit, a charismatic, elite popular leader. But when push comes to shove, the bottom one is where Griffin puts his money. The fascists in Europe believed they were living through terrible times. Germany had been defeated in World War I, tremendous inflation in the early 1920s, and then the Great Depression hit Germany and destroyed its industrial economy between 1929 and 1933. These individuals who could be optimistic about reviving the nation when the nation was on the floor, when people were giving up on it, and they were going to revive the nation by looking to its past glories, by seeing what had made the nation great. but they were also going to make changes so that the new nation would be reborn more powerful, more vibrant, more vital than it ever been before. So, a last picture of my little puzzle in trying to put together European fascism with what was going on in Montana came from an author who came through Missoula this past year, and that was Frederick Carlson. Frederick Carlson wrote a little paperback called Eternal Hostility, and his book focuses on Christian Reconstructionism or Dominion theology. And here is a kind of missing piece of the puzzle to me. What is it that this political power would be used for if we really had a successful fascist movement in the United States? What would it be used for? It would be used to win Armageddon. It's the same kind of thing that you read in Pat Robertson's book, The New World Order. The next century is going to be the century in which you have to decide whether you will fight on the side of Satan or on the side of God. And so it seems to me that American fascist is not going to be like Hitler and simply want to fight World War I all over again and win it this time. American fascist is going to continue the American mission. The American mission that we were deflected from because of all the work of the people who undermined this country from the beginning of the 20th century. Because all those immigrants from places like Greece and Italy and Poland who came to this country and deflected us from our mission. What Frederick Carlson, of course, talks about as the mission, and of course he's a critic of these people. Their mission is, to revive Puritan New England. What is, Christian Reconstructionism all about? It's a Calvinist theology, basically, that looks very much like the theologians of South Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. America should return to its Calvinist roots and get on, basically, with conquering the world for God. And that's how I view the American fascist mission. That's why religion is so important in American fascism. It plays almost no role in German fascism and Italian fascism. But it is so important, a specific kind of religion. And that's why the rise of these groups such as the Aryan Nation, the Church of Jesus Christ, Aryan. That's why this Church of Creator, that kind of thing. Here's where Roger Griffin has a real insight into fascism. Fascism takes national materials that are already there. They're in our past, and puts them together in a radically new way. And that's the insight that I arrived at this point in my travel. Because, as a historian, we recognize we always need to do more research. All we can do is give, a tentative report at this time. I like to think of Edward Gibbon, writing that series of volumes and then simply dying and not really being satisfied with his explanation. But that's where I am right now. If someone comes up to me and says, well, what do they want to do, George? I'll say, okay, I think they want to get on with what the Puritans were doing in New England, killing Indians. They want to get on with converting the world to their vision of God. They want a theocracy. Scary business, I think. Well, I'd like to open this up to questions, please. Yes.
You seem to stress much the economic roots of fascism and the historically accepted, I think, connection between the economic imperialists, capitalists, with the fascist
that's where I began. In my study of fascism, I began by reading a variety of authors from the 1950s and 1960s who stressed that, and Marxist authors, who to this day maintain that fascism is really an expression of imperialistic capitalism. But I've moved to the point right now where you don't need to have an economic collapse. You don't need to have an economic collapse. You simply have to have defeat in a war or enough anger being expressed over some kind of a retreat from traditional moral values. But I would agree with you in terms of what does it take? What is the kind of setting that would bring fascists into power? Certainly in both Italy and Germany, the Nazis and the fascists would never have come to power had they not come to power in periods of tremendous economic upheaval, when they were able to make an alliance with certain sectors of heavy industry or certain sectors of the banks. Now, what I've emphasized to you today is very much in terms of what I see going on in Montana's groups. And I think the take I get from Montana's groups is their use of economics is simply an anti-Semitic use of economics. Simply blame what's going on in terms of the changes in our economy on this Jewish conspiracy.
George, when you were talking about this concept of religion, I kept thinking not only of the city on the hill, the Puritan ideal, as it was expressed, but manifest destiny, the 19th century notion that God had smiled on the United States and decreed that we should go out and spread our progeny throughout the world, really, which we first did by occupying this continent and then going off to Southeast Asia, the Philippines, the Spanish-American War. And it seems to me that there's an economic element as well as the religious element. It may derive from this notion that you think you're God's chosen people, but there's a payoff to it too. Mm-hmm. It brings in land, it brings in commerce, it brings in goods that make you stronger as a nation, make you feel better. And I wonder if that's...
Well, you raised the question. It's called dominion theology because it comes out of that section in the book of Genesis where God gives dominion. And since we are his chosen people, that is, some kind of strange Orthodox Calvinist white Americans are God's chosen people, if you follow the Christian identity argument. We were doing the right thing basically throughout all of our history until World War I, until something happened at the highest levels of our government, and we turned against another chosen people, the German people at that time. And since then we've been without a mission as a nation. We've been misled. Again, I'm not speaking for myself, I'm speaking as though I were an American fascist explaining this to you. We've been misled basically since the time of World War I and the creation of the Federal Reserve System at the same time. We've been misled by this group of immigrants coming over here from Europe with their European connections into losing our sense of mission as a nation. And so now with the coming of the millennium on us, it's time basically to regain that focus. And it's an interesting idea. I think you'd probably agree with me. There's never been a time in this country's history where we've been so successful in terms of spreading our gospel of wealth around the world, in terms of converting economies to sort of mirror images of the worst aspects of the American economy. I mean, when historians look back on this strange period since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, since the coming down of the wall, and see what we have helped to create in Russia, we've taken those people and destroyed 50% of their productive capabilities. I mean, this next winter in Russia could very well give rise to a wonderful fascist regime as a result of what we've done there. But we've never been so successful in terms of going out and gathering the wealth of the world for ourselves. But the American fascists would say, we've not benefited from it. It's gone into this Committee of 300. We've been duped by the Committee of 300 to do all this work for them. So it's time now to take back our original mission of the nation.
Has been used in American politics in the Cold War and the crusade to Europe with some justification, but the mission idea seems to be more general than what you say to be now a mission of the right wing. It's something is more general apparently in American politics, isn't it? The idea of the crusade, I mean...
Yeah, I mean, if I couldn't give you any mission that the United States has today, but what I would tell you is, if I were an American fascist today, Dominion theology is where I'd be. I'd be making use of the growth of the Christian coalition. I'd be making use of the growth of a variety of literalist churches across the United States to get back to that fundamental Protestant ethic of this nation. If I was trying to solve American fascism, I'd be here as a minister, basically. I'd be clothing my nationalistic rhetoric in religious terms. As Ralph said, you have New England ministers at the end of the 19th century talking about, let's go across the Pacific and let's convert all the Chinese to Calvinism or some form of Protestantism. Josiah Strong is probably the most famous advocate of that. And here you get into one of those strange paradoxes. I'd be talking about these things in terms of biblical prophecy, in terms of the book of Revelation. You often hear this talked about in conferences. But what I'd be giving you is a social Darwinist. I'd be giving you a social Darwinist take on how the world actually works. Okay? That basically we can't afford to be Christians, really, because that's not the way in which the world is going to be converted. It's going to be converted by force. Yes?
Please do not turn that camera over here, okay? Sure. Thanks. I'm sorry, I do research with these folks and I don't need to be on there. I teach a class also that involves this stuff and come at it from the perspective of American history as opposed to European. And would really like in this setting to make a plea for us to look at this as a distinctly American phenomenon, which is the case that the people themselves who are involved in it, who make what they hear or tend to make in their writings, that in fact they are the ones who are true to the Constitution, that they are upholding Jeffersonian yeoman democracy, which is under attack from all sorts of other forces, and not importing some Johnny-come-lately 20th century political phenomenon here. I'm certainly not arguing with that position, but I think as people who I suspect are largely on the left politically, that we have a responsibility to listen to at least the economic side of what a lot of these folks are saying. And I know Ken Toole talks about the phenomenon as being a funnel, with a lot of people coming in the wide end, and then the folks we see producing this kind of thing popping out the small end and blowing things up. But if we start at that wide end and look at the economic critique, that when you list a committee of 300 who's running things, I'm with you. Kissinger, Rockefeller, hell yeah, those are the, that is a conspiracy for all functional purposes. That many of us, as you pointed out, would agree with, say, Barbara Ehrenreich. And one of the books we use in this class is by Joel Dyer, a journalist from Colorado, who points out that in the 70s and 80s, he was researching the farm crisis and watching where the government, where the federal government strongly suggests that you as a farmer, for example, take out enormous amounts of loans, get big or get out, this is his phrase, okay, and then come through and undercut all that, raise interest rates, and people flooding out of the countryside, right? That we can't pretend we don't have a responsibility here in creating situations. That the reason he wrote the book is that 10 years later, these same people he interviews in the 70s and 80s who are putting guns to their heads because they're losing their farms are signing up for the militia. Because guess what, folks? We weren't there saying there's another political option. You're right, the government's screwing you. Corporations are screwing you, and here's some things we can do about it. And then if the far right can come forward and offer a solution, I can't really blame some of these people for listening to it. Now, I'd be one of the first people on their hit list, which is why I don't want the camera. But we're not going to get anywhere without at least paying attention to what might drive people into there. I don't think, as a Jew, I don't think anti-Semitism is the motivating force. It's simply a good explanation when when Chase Manhattan Bank and the Federal Reserve drive you under. I'd be happy to hear how you would respond to that. But
No, I think it's our responsibility to come up with a left-wing economic program, which is so far absent in American politics.
draft Michael Moore for president.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that doing this kind of research has led me to do then is simply bring myself up to speed in terms of Noam Chomsky and David Korten and people like that. But what was it that I was hearing from Bob Fletcher? What was it that I was really seeing in these books that were being published and for on sale at their gun shows? And I was seeing an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And I can very well say, yeah, I can believe in a conspiracy, but I don't want to have it as a racial conspiracy, I don't want to have it as a religious conspiracy. I want to have this as the kind of the natural workings of what William Greider calls this, a pathological capitalism that we're in
So let's
today.
get out there and say that to those people and quit talking to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We sit here and say with a sort of sneering tone, these silly people, they believe this, they believe this. Well, okay, if you don't want them believing that, we need to go out and make just as strong an argument for what we think the conspiracy is all I'm saying. That it won't do to sneer at the folks down at the checkout counter at Walmart and then wait till they come after you with a gun. You've got to intervene before that point and at least understand what puts them there.
But I take John Trotman and Bo Greitz and Bob Fletcher and Green quite seriously in terms of what they want to do in destroying our democracy and basically turning us against each other on racial lines or religious lines. I take that quite seriously. But I quite agree with you that this, I think, is where the left is being way behind the curve, because my reading throughout my life has not been in studying how capitalism works. We need to really find out how this kind of financial capitalism system is working today. I understand there's a peace and social justice group at this church. I know in Butte, we're organizing a peace and social justice group for the first time at my parish. And this will be one of the things that we'll be studying. We'll be studying the gospel in terms of welfare, in terms of economics. And I think for too long, the left basically, and I blame myself for this, I've read a lot more Marxist authors than I've ever read people. Noam Chomsky says, if you want to know what's going on in the United States of America, read the Wall Street Journal. These people brag about what they're doing. He says he was in London and the Financial Times there, it says, America is booming. Americans have never had it so good. And then you take a look at the statistics given you by the Federal Reserve Bank in their largest survey they ever did of wealth in the United States. They interviewed more than 5,000 people. And they published this in 1995. And I got this from something called the Left Business Review. And the guy who put this together, two guys who put this together, said, the Federal Reserve Bank wasn't going to make any sense out of this. We had to go through their numbers and pick it out what was there. But when you look at the numbers, it's horrific. 1% of the American population owns 40% of the assets in the United States, 40% of the wealth. You'd have to go back to the late 1920s to find that. Just 20 years ago, it was 20% of the wealth. Then, the next 9% of the American population owns 30% of the wealth. The rest of the 90% own then 30% of wealth and assets.
But isn't this the new American mission to spread democracy all over the world, forgetting that democracy and capitalism are incompatible?
Yeah, this is the major message that has to get out. That when these people are talking about free trade, free markets, and democracy, free markets and free trade have nothing to do with democracy whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the free trade they're talking about is simply the freedom of financial capital to flow anywhere it wants in the world. But if workers in Detroit who are laid off go down to the Mexican border and try to get a job in Mexico, their free trade stops right there. And it's the same for any of us. So
Talk about a coalition, you could get the militias on board to repeal NAFTA, I think.
that's right. Yeah. Yes.
I'd like you to comment more on the populist aspect of fascism, because I think that's what we're talking about, economic solutions that appeal to the working class, but they're more to populism, and populism in itself, I don't think is a sinister type of idea.
No, it need not be a sinister type of idea at all. The reason that people like Roger Griffin put populism in there is that fascism is a modern movement. It would never come on the stage unless you had mass-based politics, unless you had democratic movements. The kind of nationalism that fascism is talking about is a nationalism that will appeal to all of it. It has to appeal to a mass base, and that's where you get the populism. And if you take a look at how did the Nazis ever get to? They never won 50% in a free election in Germany. But how did they get up to 40%? I mean, they'd been a little right-wing oddball group 3 years before they came to power. How did they get up to that? They made use of a farm crisis in Germany. They made use of a rural crisis in which mainly Protestant small farmers were going under. I used to believe, because Hitler himself came from Austria, that it was the Catholics in Germany who gave him support. No, it was Protestant small farmers who were nationalists, who looked to him as a way of giving them a new deal. But again, religion plays a role in that as well. There's something about Protestantism in terms of the United States, in terms of Germany, that, to my mind, it's simply the kind of individualism that you find in Protestant. Yes?
I have a two-part question. One is about corporations. In fact, through my readings, I found, I believe it was in the late 18th century, early 20th century, that corporations actually are sovereign entities themselves and aren't subject to the Constitution. In fact, a lot of these ever-growing multinationals don't really have any real law to kind of answer to. They're sovereign within themselves, almost purposely set up that way.
I tried to make this point against the Montana Power Company when I ran against Joe Quillisi just a few months ago. As I understand it, corporations, go all the way back to the 17th century in England, and they were created to do some specific public function. And they were given a charter which limited them and made them accountable to Parliament. And in the history of the United States, in several cases in the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, states have simply pulled in the charters of corporations that were not accountable, that were not doing what they were set up to do. And so, I've joined FOCLAD within the last 6 months as a result of my research on this same thing. We need to hold our corporations accountable for doing something very specific. We cannot give them the power of a nation state, which they have right now.
But our laws legally hold them accountable only to their own stockholders. And in fact, it's illegal, it's against the law for them to do anything that lowers the profit of their stockholders. So if you kill 6,000 people in Bhopal, India, which release these gases, you can't even admit that you made a mistake there because that would hurt your stockholders, which might be those of us in this room,
But corporations, are created basically by states. Ronnie Duggar has an interesting initiative in California right now, which is to pull the charter of, was it Unocal? He wants to pull the charter of Unocal because of its offshore drilling in California. That'd be an interesting test case to stay in touch with. This may be where it's at. in terms of taking back our nation and making our nation responsible to the rest of the world. I've come to the conclusion that the nation state is being replaced by multinational corporations. That when we elect the President of the United States right now, we have multinational corporations competing against each other, basically. We get to choose one or the other. I shouldn't say things like this. It's getting too late.
The
Yes.
second part was the Freemasons you mentioned, well, was mentioned in the book. Through some of my researches, for a president to be elected, in fact, has to be part of that order. I don't know if you had any experience coming across any research along those lines. In fact, you know, the 33-degree Masonry in the sect.
Yeah, I just have to plead total ignorance of that. After reading Nesta Webster on Freemasons, I never wanted to read anything more in my life about them. Because what she maintains is that this is nothing more than a Jewish conspiracy that dates all the way back to the Talmud. She dates this all the way back to ancient Babylon. That in every generation they've been working, and just happened they needed the organization of these Freemasons to come on the scene in the 18th century to bring about the French Revolution. So I said, no, I don't want to read anything more about Freemasons.
On our dollar bill.
Oh yeah, we have Masonic symbols on the $100 bill. And I mean, you have Masonic lodges in all kinds of small towns in Montana. They've been a very effective social and political group.
George, let's take one more question.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Yes?
Now, in this democracy, I can go down to the ballot and make choices about who I want to vote for. I can also go down to the supermarket or the hardware store and buy a wide variety of goods. And I can do neither in non-democratic countries such as the President, Soviet Union, and other, ultra-totalitarian nations. You do neither. Now, are you telling me there's no relationship between my going down and voting for who I choose and being able to buy what I choose? Or are you telling me there's no relationship there?
Well, I think the argument is between capitalism and democracy, there is no relationship there. As a result, if you simply allow unregulated capitalism to go off, as William Bryder's book, One World Ready or Not, is a very good introduction to this. If you simply allow unregulated capitalism to work out its will, you're going to have a mass of very poor people and a small group of very powerful financial and political people at the top. I mean, the American political system today seems to me to prove that. Because when I go to the ballot, I don't see any candidates there I want to vote for. What I see are people who have amassed, several $1 million from corporations or political action committees to win the primary campaigns, and then I get to go and vote between these two candidates who will be different in some way. One may be, against abortion, and one may be for choice. But in terms of what their economic program is, I can't tell the difference between them.
I mean, if you look around the world, look at the different democracies. They're all
Well,
fairly prosperous.
I grant you that, Germany...
South Africa is becoming more prosperous as it's moved into the...
But take a look at German democracy, take a look at French democracy or English democracy. Those democracies function a great deal differently than we do because of World War II and the Great Depression. When those democracies were really created was between 1945 and 1947. And they were created at a time when people wanted the government to be active in the economy in providing a certain minimum level of security. They wanted the economy, they wanted the government to, in England, for example, for the first time to give free education to students. But take a look at the United States. We did not come out of a government that provided that kind of democratic socialism, that kind of foundation for us. And all we've seen basically is an attack on the pre-World War II programs, the New Deal programs, and now the Great Society programs. And I can't consider that attack to be any way democratic or pro-democracy. I see it basically as a way of taking government programs and privatize them so that corporations can make money. I mean, to me, it's a crime that you would have Lockheed Martin hired by the state of Texas to help solve Texas welfare programs. That every welfare mother in the state of Texas basically is being handled by a Lockheed Martin employee. I mean, the Cold War ends, and now we bring the defense industry home to build prisons and to take care of our welfare program, and now our hospitals as well.
And they were given a lot of money to integrate the two companies too. Our tax dollars paid for that integration of those two
Yeah, about $100 million was spent to merge those two, because they had to downsize.
It helps to know that Lockheed Martin Marietta is the district that Newt Gingrich was elected out of. I love conspiracy theory.
I'm sure George will stay around and continue discussion with whoever would like to, but we'll give people who need to go home a chance to. Thank you all
Well, just
for your
one
time.
question. I want to thank you very much. Getting out. Thank you very much. I want to just say, getting out and speaking to folks energizes me. I have a little prayer. It's not very long, but it's something that Mary Kay Craig, my wife, and I picked up in Great Falls a couple of weeks ago, and we thought it was appropriate to us. It's adapted from a prayer by Sister Ruth Fox. May God bless you with foolishness to think you can make a difference in this world, so that you will do the things which others tell you you cannot do.